Welcome to Bookswell Intersections. I'm your host, Cody Sisco. Today my guest is Rasheed Newson. Rasheed is the author of My Government Means to Kill Me, which examines the political and sexual coming of age of a young gay black man in New York City in the 1980s. The novel was a 2023 Lambda Literary finalist for gay fiction and was named one of the 100 notable books of 2022 by the New York Times. Rasheed lives with his husband and their two children in Pasadena. Welcome, Rasheed.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we met last year, not so long ago, at the We Who Reads Literary Deathmatch event, and you served as a judge for the competition, and you also impressed the crowd with the depth of your literary knowledge. Would you like to share any highlights or what just happened moments from the event?
What I love about Literary Deathmatch is essentially it asked like 6 different authors or writers to read some of their work, and then it's got 3 other writers or who are then giving sort of commentary, and most of it's funny and it's in good fun.
Yeah.
I like doing it. It was a lot of pressure. I've done it as a competitor, so to speak, and read there once.
Moved up through the ranks.
I moved up to become a judge. And it's more pressure to be a judge. I mean, when you're reading, you know what you're going to say, and you can just, you can rely on the text. As a judge, you've got to really, you've got to come up with something funny and amusing in the moment. One of the highlights is Pickle, the drag queen, was
Yes.
there, and she is incredibly funny, and it sort of upped my game. Like, if you ever find yourself needing to be funny, somebody like you play tennis with a better partner.
Yeah.
Match wits with the drag queen, and it will make you funnier and sharper.
Yeah, and she was sitting like right next to you, so I'm sure that was a lot.
It was. My job. What I thought I could bring to it was trying to place the writers in front of us into a literary family.
Mm-hmm.
So like R.K. Russell, who is a former NFL player who is bisexual and has written a memoir. Referring to him as sort of the NFL's version of Maya Angelou was what I brought to the table. Just being like, okay, I know where you belong at the grand dinner party of authors.
Yeah, and that elevates their work and their standing, and we all want to see that.
It's a great event. I love doing.
So let's talk a little bit about your book, My Government Means to Kill Me. The main character is Trey, who is, as I mentioned in the introduction, young gay black man who leaves behind a wealthy, connected, activist family to move to New York and live his own life, like in the very go-go time, but also the very apocalyptic times of the mid-'80s, right in the middle of the HIV/AIDS crisis. What inspired you to write a character like Trey?
Well, I wanted to write about the era, just those years in New York where AIDS is really gathering as a crisis, and there needs to be a response from our community. And I wanted to write about it because I could feel that history was sort of slipping away from the public consciousness, which is not, by the way, a criticism of just young people. I think people my age and older, there were a lot of people who wanted to forget that ever happened because it was so dreadful and so horrible. Mm-hmm. I was born in 1979, so I was a child when most of the story takes place. But I was in school in the late 80s and into the 90s at a time when people who had direct contact with that experience were teachers and were in our lives, and they brought that into the classroom. Mm. Even me going to a Catholic school in Indiana, people were brought in to talk about the AIDS crisis and what was then still going on. And I think that has fallen away because of PrEP and the wonderful advances we've made in terms of just people being able to protect themselves, whether they're positive or negative, people being able to sort of make this a disease you can live with.
Yeah.
There's a feeling of it's just this dark thing that maybe we shouldn't mention, and I don't like to see history lost. So that was a big drive for me to just tackle this world. And I went in with Trey because I wanted younger readers who may not know the first thing about New York in the 80s and the music or the clothes or the politics, but they know what it is to be young. And they can relate to Trey, who, when you first move him and moves to New York, if you put all the history aside, put the context aside, he's a young person who's moved to a new city. Yeah. He's got to find a place to live. He's got to find a job. He's got to find friends. He's got to figure out where he's going to get laid. And those things tend to be universal when you are young and moving to a new city. So at least gave young readers something they could hold on to, something that they could see themselves in Trey.
Yeah, yeah. And it's the history of that era along with the activism is still relevant today. So there's no need to bridge that. Like the activism that swelled in the 80s around the AIDS crisis, I mean, we are living through another pandemic right now, right? And, while we've made a lot of progress in terms of rights and representation for LGBTQ people, there's still a long way to go. And what I loved about this book was the way that you intertwined both the sort of gay liberation movement aspect of activism in it, as well as the civil rights activism. And those kind of came together for Trey and put him in a very interesting position in terms of what he could advocate for and how he moved into that phase of his life. I do want to ask you about his mentors. So this story is populated by like legendary characters who he interacts with directly. He's a fictional character, but he's interacting with Bayard Rustin and Larry Kramer and sort of luminaries of those movements that I mentioned. How did you approach writing that blend of fact and fiction, where those real life icons were having an impact on him?
It was tough because I didn't want to. I mean, like I want to point out, like
okay.
I mean, Larry Kramer was still alive when I started writing this book, and Larry Kramer could be a very intimidating figure. And I thought, well, I don't
radar, right? Or maybe you do.
Yeah, I mean, like he died before it got published, which absolved me of having to find out. But I don't know that I could have expected him to love or embrace it, but I probably would have heard about it if he had heard about it.
Right.
What happened though is when you start writing a book and then suddenly you need someone to. I knew this was going to be about him sort of falling into the birth of ACT UP. Mm-hmm. You start thinking, well, maybe I'll do these stand-ins, but everybody's going to know who the stand-in is.
Yeah.
People who know the history, and it feels rather cheap, and you look rather timid. And so I said, well, let's just go do the real people. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, if you are writing historical fiction about anybody in the second half of the 20th century, there's a large video and audio archive on how they spoke and how they lived. And so you have hours and hours of material. And I mean, I list in the book a lot of the sources I use, but like Making Gay History podcast was incredibly invaluable. They had Larry Kramer, they had Bayard Rustin, and you could listen to that for hours to get a sense of their voice and how they thought. And they're still sort of my fictional creation, right? So I didn't feel that I was totally beholden to saying it just the way they may say something. You're looking for a few hooks that distinguish them. But I also try to remind people, because I know now it looks like, oh, Trey he met these big names. That is sort of how the past works. At the time, people aren't as big as they will become. They're not legendary yet.
Yeah.
This book takes place in the mid-'80s. Larry Kramer is not quite a giant. He's a loudmouth crank who organizes and gets a lot of things done. But nobody at that moment is like he's going to be a luminary of the 20th century.
Right.
That comes later. Bayard Rustin at this point is almost out in the cold. Mm-hmm. Not to put too fine a point on it, but his biggest days, the days where he had the most access to power, are well behind him.
Yeah.
He's been rediscovered, thankfully, recently in our time, but running into him in the mid-'80s would have been something you might have mentioned at a dinner party, and I don't think anybody would have talked about it for more than 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, he sacrificed his profile and his power for the movement, and sort of, took a step back from the spotlight. I want to ask you about the footnotes, because this I love footnotes. Like when I read Infinite Jest, like way back in the 90s, I was just like, what is this like treasure of stuff? And a lot of those were irreverent, but it seemed to me that you were using them as like a a jumping off point to educate the reader, and for the reader who wanted to go find out more about these historic events, that context that fills in some of the gaps that maybe we don't have or were never exposed to. Why was it important for you to include them?
Well, one of the big points I wanted to make about the strength of like ACT UP and I will say the LGBTQ plus response to AIDS is that it came together very quickly, and it was very powerful and very effective. My theory or hypothesis on that is it worked because it was building on the experience of all of these previous movements. That if you found yourself in the mid-'80s and you were a certain age, you might have been part of the women's rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, and the civil rights movement. So, suddenly, how do we get press attention, and how do we organize, and how do we get the word out? These people had a wealth of knowledge that made them incredibly effective. They also had, and this is where Trey comes in, a lot of young people who maybe it was their first movement, but understood that this was a direct threat to their lives.
Yeah.
And were willing to throw their bodies on the line. And those two things coming together, strategic know-how. I mean, it matters that you are able to get on the front page of the newspapers, on the evening news, but you also need people who are going to be foot soldiers in that movement. And ACT UP did that. I mean, almost better. I mean, it's glorious and it's effective. And I don't know how all of that is we all know that, right? That's what they teach us. What I want to point out is it's also clever. Mm-hmm. I mean, they would go to a government building, and instead of trying to storm the building and take control of the building, they would just scale the side of the walls and put up a banner outside the building. Well, on the 6 o'clock news, it looks like they took control of the building.
Right.
And no one ever walked inside.
Yeah.
One of my other favorite ones, orchestrated by Peter Staley, which I just think I adore him and I think is a great one, is just as a message, they put a giant condom over Senator Jesse Helms' house. Because if you put a condom on a senator's house, they have to cover it in the news. And when they cover it, they have to explain ACT UP.
A condom.
And who's ACT UP and what's their message and what are they doing? And it's and no one sort of is getting hurt, and it's provocative and this gets lost because normally most causes they're dealing with serious issues. Mm-hmm. How about we could also be funny while we do this? It's cheeky, and I'm a big fan of that.
I remember I heard an interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci a couple of years ago where he was talking about his role in the HIV/AIDS crisis, I think, and how and when the CDC and the FDA all started to pivot, from basically just ignoring that it was going on, and he credited ACT UP with getting his attention personally, and shifting sort of his role. But I think one thing you've done so well in this book is cover the kind of cross currents of activism and the assimilationist versus radical strains of activism, and then the story of the movement's founding, where they basically stage a spontaneous beginning. It was at the Gay Men's Health Center, spontaneous blossoming of a new movement, but it's been planned for weeks. I think that was really illuminating.
Well, there are other histories on ACT UP, and especially oral histories, which are just straight fact. And one of the things that really comes up is, people use Larry's speech, as I present it, as this idea of that's where it began. But when you talk to people, that idea had been circulating for years, and other people had been introduced it, and so. What ends up happening, though, when you create an organization is it needs an origin story. Right. And that became the accepted origin story. Whether it was strictly true or not, whether it was spontaneous or not. And I kind of love that about history. And I talk about that even with the civil rights movement, the idea that Rosa Parks just decided not to give her seat up on a bus one day. Oh, come on. I mean, she was so connected to the movement in so many ways. That wasn't just, I think I'll do this on a random Tuesday.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit. You mentioned, Trey comes to New York and he's got a few priorities. His housing situation's a bit precarious, and there's some run-ins with the Trump family that are really humorous. But he's also kind of like making a home base for himself out of a fictional bathhouse.
The bathhouse is real.
The bathhouse Mount Morris is closed, but was open and was real.
Was open then. It was, yeah.
Yeah. He, what, I mean, it's nice to go back and like think about, what would that have been like? And, wouldn't that be fun to live through? When you look at the time period where this took place, kind of after a period of, say, the 70s, where it was just sexual excess and everything was like kind of open, and then this threat of HIV/AIDS coming in the 80s, and then moving on to now, where we do have effective preventive treatment for HIV. How do you think the shifting kind of sexual environment has changed gay culture over the years?
Well, this is my little hobby horse. I feel like bathhouses in general got a horrible rap. That even when, yes, there were, first of all, if they were just places to have sex, that would have been enough. The reason why we have bathhouses is because two men would have had a hard time even getting a hotel room to go screw if the people running the hotel room knew that was happening. I always sometimes push back when people sort of say, oh, isn't it weird? Like, why do gay men, why are you doing public sex? Why are they in the woods? It's like, well, you wouldn't let us be anywhere else.
Right. And the private life was closeted. Yeah.
So that's one. The other is they did, though, serve as more than just sex. Mm-hmm. You look at some place like the Continental Baths, where they would have, concerts with like Bette Midler and Rod Stewart and shows.
I remember
one of the things I found
time and so like, what? How is that?
Oh, yeah.
That's amazing.
And then one of the things I found particularly heartwarming is there were ads, particularly in the 70s and into the 80s, where bathhouses would be saying, hey, it's Thanksgiving. Don't have any place to go. We're having a buffet down here. We're serving. You need a place to go for Christmas? We're going to raffle off gifts.
Yeah.
That it also was a place for people who might be lonely, who might be looking for community. I'm old enough to have gone to bathhouses in my 20s, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And yeah, there was sex and that was fun, but there was always community. This is what's sort of great about being queer. Like, you get 10 of us together and there's going to be a good time, whether there's sex or not. And I've written a little bit about this, but there was one time I was in the bathhouse and it was a little slow, and there were people there, but none of us were interested in each other. Mm-hmm. And they had Jeopardy on in the lounge. And we all just started like answering the Jeopardy questions collectively, and we got everyone right. And when Alex Trebek took us to commercial break, we applauded. And that was a really sweet moment. And I wanted that represented, and I wanted that reclaimed. There's always been, first there was a criminalization around our sex. Right. And then because of AIDS, there was, a health danger posed by our sex. As those things are suddenly dissipating or becoming more manageable, certainly not over, but better than they were, I'm kind of enjoying watching sex sort of get its proper place in everybody's life, where it's just like, if you want it, go get it. If you don't worry about it. It's a lot to have to think about your sex or the pursuit of sex as a criminal act, or a risk to your health.
Right.
My God, isn't it nice that you can just now, just go sleep with somebody, and that's what you did on Saturday afternoon? Yeah. And so I'm that sort of gives me joy that people can just, can we curse on this?
Yeah, go for it.
That you can fuck without existential dread.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
And I think,
growing up, the number of times even if you did everything right, even if you used the condom, no one even would come. And like, whatever it was, something in your head said, I better get down to the clinic. You just never know.
yeah,
And honey, in our 20s to have to go through that, I'm glad that can be alleviated.
Yeah.
We didn't need that.
to be fair, I think a lot of people are still working it out. Like that kind of formative experience where sex and death are so intermingled, you know.
Yeah.
And we grew up, you know, we're of the same generation. We grew up kind of the first gay generation to be missing the one that came before.
Yeah.
We didn't have a lot of people, you know, older than us around, unfortunately.
I remember, I was in my mid-20s, and I was in LA, so I was like 25. And there was a gay club called Rage, used to be. And outside at Rage, there was a group of guys, and one of them was having his 40th birthday party. So this is, again, almost 20 years ago. But he was having his 40th birthday party, and something about it struck me as like I had never seen that before, and then I remembered why.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot, and it's our history, and it's the legacy we're kind of living inside of. So your book examines that piece of it. It also examines race, family dynamics, and many different strains of politics. By writing the book, have you come to sort of new understanding or wisdom about all of those things now in the 2020 period?
Well, one of the things in this, I mean, when I see political movements now, and there can be their differing opinions, and those fights can be vicious and very rough, even on our own side, on the same issue where we want the same goals.
Yeah.
The question of how we get there. Should it be incremental? Should we demand change? How radical should we be? How patient should we be? Those are very intense fights. And I think we should have those disagreements. But especially after writing this book and just doing the reading and the research, I urge everybody on the same side to be gentler with each other. That the truth is, you know, the people who want something incremental don't tend to get that if there isn't a radical wing that the power structure is so scared of, they go, let me make a deal with you. And the people on the radical wing have to also sort of accept that pragmatism is not a dirty word, right? So all of this fighting and all the passion, I don't want to lose the passion. I think it's unfortunate that the passion can sometimes become lifelong animosity between the players involved. And I look back on this, it's interesting. And you know, a lot of people who worked in ACT UP, I mean, you have to remember one thing. They didn't know they were about to dedicate 10, 20, 30 years to that movement.
Right.
They had no idea how long that commitment would be. And for some of them who their goal was to eradicate AIDS or stop the crisis in its tracks, walked away feeling like they had failed. And I look at it with distance and history, and I'm thinking, this is pound for pound one of the most effective, innovative movements that ever graced the earth.
Yeah.
But the people in it didn't necessarily have that opinion of themselves, because they're kind of on the ground, and they're in this cross current of loss and infighting that was pretty remarkable. And I wanted to sort of shed a light on that. But one of the things I hope we take from it is we don't have to kill each other in the struggle.
Yeah. Well, one of the themes in the book is around kind of this idea of burnout and caretaking, and how the helpers help those in need. And there's a character of Angie who is sort of the last person that many men who perished will see, because she's taking care of them in her home as a kind of makeshift hospice. And there's discussions between her and Trey and the character who introduced them, I think Peter, about sort of motivation for getting involved in the struggle and how to stay in it for the long term, or at least through a lot of really heavy times. Is that, I mean, and we didn't really have, I mean, concepts or even, we didn't talk about it this way. We didn't have like self-care or all of that back then. It was, you know, many people just worked until their bodies gave out. Is there anything there in terms of, was it difficult to not use your like current day lens in writing about that?
Well, right. So they can never use the language we would use. So like, by the way, I'm writing a new book and it's like gay black men in the 50s and 60s. And even the term closeted isn't a term they would use. To, you know, you would say you're discreet. You would say it's a private matter. You would say all these other things. So like I'm constantly trying to make sure that they're not picking up the lens we now have for some of this. And it's why nobody ever really kind of comes to Angie and says, "Are you okay? Are you having burnout?" Because and I also looked at, one of the thing I'd learned, I used to work in nonprofits for years when I was younger. There's a way in which everybody goes, "Oh, that's just Ange. She's fine." You know, you tell yourself that these people are a rock and they'll always be able to do it. And there was less of an appreciation on looking at the helpers, in part also because there were so many people dying.
Yeah.
Like it almost felt, I'm sure, selfish to say, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I mean, these are people who are dying. And I also, with people like Angie, people who would just sort of open their homes and take care of people who were dying, they, again, didn't know what kind of commitment they were signing on for. You know, you let one or two people in and then someone calls and says they got another one, and suddenly you have 4, 5, 6 people. Right. And there's no real end in sight. And so a lot of people, and this happens now. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but around like Black Lives Matters and some of those movements, some of the key people were in their 40s and 50s, and then they like die of a heart attack. Because to live under that pressure and that stress does something to you. It was important for me to write it in the book to remind people of it. Age is important in a lot of ways. I mean, that hospice is for men who are primarily men who are black, because while TV has sort of shown us like white people dying of AIDS who maybe their parents begrudgingly let them come home, or they've got this network around them. Right. For a lot of gay black men who found themselves HIV positive, first of all, no one in their community knew they were gay. So they can't even walk through that door.
They have HIV because immediately that would be coming out, yeah.
Oh, my goodness. And so they just sort of disappeared from our communities. A lot of them died on the street. A lot of them died in homeless shelters. So Angie taking them in is a rarity and a gift. It's reminding everybody that not everybody got to have the, and I love this movie, so I don't want anybody to think I don't love this movie, and I love the person who wrote the book. But in The Gloaming, do you remember this?
I haven't seen that, no.
It stars Glenn Close, and she has this estranged relationship with her son, and her son is dying of AIDS, and he comes home to die. And they sort of repair the relationship before he dies. Beautiful story. That is not happening in the black community so much. So first, Angie was just a lens into that experience for gay black men. I also just want to remind everybody of the vital role that lesbians played during this crisis that somehow just keeps getting edited out of most stories. I mean, you watch a lot of gay movies, and I understand. I can both understand why the narrative did this, but also we need to correct the narrative. But the story would somehow end with 4 gay men standing on the beach staring into the ocean. And I'm like, okay, maybe that happened somewhere, but that is not the whole story.
Yeah.
And so I wanted that for Angie. Finally, I also wanted to point out that that typically people who do good work are presented as saintly, long-suffering people. I promise you, from years and years and years in nonprofit work, some of the people who do some of the most caring, hard, generous, compassionate work, people you think would qualify for sainthood, they were mean, they were biting, they were people you did not want to cross. They did not suffer fools. Yeah. And I wanted that to be reflected in Angie as well.
Yeah, and maybe they had previous misdeeds that they were making up for.
Yeah.
Redemption.
That driver, I mean, that question of why we give our lives to a cause is always very personal. And it has to be strong. Otherwise, you will not get up every day and answer the call.
Yeah.
And there's almost typically a haunted nature to that drive.
Yeah. So I have one more question for you, and this one, I'm not even sure how to put it, but it's about Gregory, so Trey's roommate, who, I don't know, are we going to get a novel from you from Gregory's point of view, or someone like Gregory who sort of, has chosen sex work and generally with like a wealthier clientele? I mean, I feel like there's a whole story there.
I love Gregory, and I do want to do a sequel to this novel on two fronts, and I can tell you I can set it up here. One is, by 1992, Larry Kramer says that ACT UP is being run by lunatics, and I would like Trey to be one of the lunatics.
Okay.
So I would like to just start there. But the other is, at the end of this book, Trey really does break his relationship with Gregory, and I think that he has to answer for that. Trey, I want to come back around on that later. One of the things that helped me understand Gregory from the start, and this isn't giving too much away, when he meets Trey, he sort of like talks his way into becoming Trey's roommate.
Yeah.
He says he has places to go and he's vague about it, but my feeling is Gregory was already experiencing homelessness when he met Trey. Yeah. That his life was already unstable and on the skids. And Trey, being naive and young, looks at Gregory, who's sexy and older, and he falls for the bravado. He believes, well, this guy knows what he's doing.
It seems like a very New York story.
They're both kids.
Yeah.
And I want to revisit both of them. I mean, primarily to address what happens at the end of this book.
That is great to hear, and I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Rasheed, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. This is fun.
It's great talk. Yeah. And you all can find Rasheed Newson at rasheednewson.com. Thank you.